The Second Holy Crusade of the Uva Xevani began in earnest in 2488. This time, they kept it simple. A massed fleet pressed north towards the border, crashing into the SI fleet coming the other way. The war was to begin with an all-against-all battle, ships against ships, moons against moons, and the behemoth planet craft clearing through all comers as the ancient empire's ace in the hole. In front of the superweapons, the smaller ships charged each other with turrets glowing. The SI's strategy was to cover the battle stations for long enough to fire the Giga Lances. The Uva Xevani plan was to indulge their spiritual fervor with closer range killing, an impossibility as the SI did not follow the old tradition of deploying manually piloted craft. Cutting up SI metal would have to do, and it worked well. Yet no solution had been found to the issue of the matter disintegrators. Thus, while the Uva Xevani fleet was large and powerful, it was destroyed almost down to the last ship in this exchange. They took virtually all the SI ships with them, but with the mass harvested from old Uva Xevani planets, they could be easily replaced and relinked into the Military Administration Department's controllers within weeks. The moons were a different affair. As before, their mighty weapons were strong enough to disable each other, but this time the balance had been altered. It was 2 ancient moons to 7 new, enough that after the exchange of stored energy, one of the SI moons was still powered up. More energy was beamed in from Chirisix, rushing into receiver dishes on the moon's rear side. This allowed the particle lance to be recharged within days of great cost at the hands of the behemoth. The planet craft had its own Giga Lance, stronger than those carried on its companion moons, albeit by surprisingly little given its much greater size. The planet craft was a more ancient construct than the rest of these superweapons. When the planetary lance first fired, 2 of the SI moons were caught in the wide beam. They were superheated, causing such damage through the resultant explosions in the interior that their surfaces burst open in eruptions of molten rock. The dozen or so crew were killed without hope, and the stations were effectively returned to being the hulks of silent mass they had been mutated from. The disabled moons still remaining were able to generate a modicum of power by using matter disintegrators on their own interior. The process gave off enough radiation and stray particles to ignite a few reactors and get a trickle from the engines. With this, they could hobble over to block the operational moon from view. Another was lost to the next planetcraft blast. Then, the operational moon finally closed its receivers and lit up the system with another lance. It hit an Uva Xevani moon, collapsing its firing tube like a sinkhole and knocking it onto a collision course with Kaid, appearing like a slowly spinning, deflated ball. Fortunately, the planet craft did not fire again, nor did it move. Its own energy situation was less than ideal, so it waited to get a shot on the active moon. The Crusaders had to watch their other moon be stripped of its engines and begin drifting into a high orbit, taking hundreds of thousands of occupants with it. The battle, while still ongoing, had cooled off into something of a siege. If the SI broke ranks, their last operational weapon could be destroyed, so all they could do was frantically repair all the fried systems inside the duds. It would be a good year before a fresh set of conventional ships was supplied from the busy Mercury shipyards, so no relief was imminent. The tension finally broke the Uva Xevani. The behemoth began to turn, and in the same hour its main gun lost its on-target trajectory, the SI tried their luck with another lance burst. It seemed to just disappear at the surface of the planet, taken away and dissipated by ancient dark matter pulse shields. Still, to receive a hit on their shield was dishonor enough for the Crusaders, and they responded by slipping away into an unguided hyper jump. Technically, the battle was a victory then. The SI had the field, but were down a space fleet and 3 battle stations, and what was left needed a complete refit. All forces were withdrawn, and ultimately no one was left standing. Now though, the vastly superior industrial capacity of the SI could be brought to bear. A mere drop of the Birch World project's yearly budget needed to be diverted to restore the surviving moons, and a new conventional fleet was of negligible cost. They were gone only a few months. The Uva Xevani citizens in Kaid were convinced to surrender in the meantime. They had been astounded by the flight of the planet craft, becoming convinced that they were being forsaken on a level much deeper than military pragmatism. Now the SI had its own branch of Uva Xevani spiritualists operating in neighbouring systems. An easy way out, a second chance, was theirs to provide. The next year, the planet craft returned to the hyperlane network, but remained in the uncontested western reaches for now, much as it had in the previous war. This meant that Celestial Throne, the Empire's historic hub in Tirmana, was subject to wave after wave of assault landers with no hope of rescue. The Crusaders on the planet craft might have thought themselves the centre of the Empire, but to the regular folk, Celestial Throne held that honour. It was an honour more than worth dying for, bringing about the most brutal fighting ever put to galactic record. The SI was no longer concerned with recovering Uva Xevani civilization intact. They just needed a surrender, and for that a campaign of indiscriminate orbital bombing was deemed suitable. Again the warriors withdrew to prepared defences underground, expanded in the previous decade such that the fortified layers of warrens totaled a greater surface area than the planet above. It was nothing less than the SI had expected, and they replied in turn with the results of their own preparations. Billions of clone soldiers, augmented with limbs enough to operate a suite of offensive and defensive measures. Hovering craft would bore pits into the ground with mass disintegrators, and a few million troops would crowd in to storm all the tunnel segments the pit exposed. As the interior of the fortress was packed with strongpoints, each pit only brought limited gains. The alternative was to disintegrate the entire underside of the crust and end the battle there and then. But that same crust was packed with salvage that was worth more than the lives of the clones dying to acquire it. A conventional battle carried on, fought in pitch dark against psychic opponents. When one division captured a tunnel or cave, a second would recover the equipment from the fallen and drive it onwards, never resting, never sensing the flow of reserves crowding from behind diminish. By the end of 2490, Celestial Throne's interior was silent once again, and the surface was the hub of an empire no more. The symbolic fall of that spiritual centre broke the spirits of the planets yet to be attacked, and when SI landing craft streaked down through the atmosphere, only the most devout forwent surrender. The behemoth was now truly isolated, and as such it was time for a final showdown. The SI fleets gathered together and pushed west to force the behemoth back into the action. A short battle ensued, in which the planet craft ably destroyed all the ships sent at it, yet in doing so was distracted enough to allow 4 gigalance blasts to batter its shields. The nature of pulse shields is such that if attacked a great deal, they shrink to maintain their integrity over a smaller area. This exposed the protruding main gun, and it was promptly deformed by the heat of the blasts. When the planet craft returned fire, the beam was unfocused and weak. At this, the planet craft withdrew once again. Uva Xevani experienced pride at heightened levels, so the void these defeats left were all-consuming. The war nominally continued until the end of 2491, when the entire Empire's surrender had been acquired. The Crusaders agreed technically to a ceasefire rather than outright surrender, a salve for that phantom pride. The holdouts were confined to 2 systems outside the old Empire's border, left with the weapons in their hands but nothing to fight for. This was the SI's victory. They were the arbiters of violent action in the galaxy now. As for the Immortharans, with a mere 1 battle moon and a recently destroyed navy, No one could look at them as a contender. This was precisely what the Council of Peers had envisioned. Nothing could stop them now. During those 2 decades of war, the syndicates, the primary body of the SI, had been building the new virtual. They had worked alongside the citizenry to create a world that would seem wonderful to one who had never been absorbed into the foggy malaise of the old virtual. Ignorance of the possibilities afforded the SI consent to implement key restrictions. No manifesting imagination, no consciousness sharing or suppression, and most of all, no private realities. It was simply a terrestophile's notion of paradise, and when those inside began to think of improvements, they would run up against the agreed upon rules. This would be the primary battleground for SI agents henceforth. Propaganda espousing the necessity of virtual limitations had to be circulated at all times. Each new entrant had 50 years of compulsory education in all manner of skills, and the SI-friendly theory of virtual existence was a part of these courses from day one. Those skills were required, for in the new virtual, life was something of a contest. This was a device to keep all engaged with the grounded activities the SI would like, mainly artistic endeavours. The pressure to contribute to this brought on enough stress to have the no-frills paradise they lived in seem a secondary concern, dampening movements seeking to change it. Of course, it didn't capture everyone, and so-called revolutionaries were the other big concern. SI operatives would be regularly forced to enter the virtual in search of those suspect of manifesting their thoughts or running personal realities on government computing resources. Things went wrong regularly. Public reality was outright destroyed a few times a day, but the whole system ran moment-to-moment backups that could be reloaded seamlessly. Every now and again, people would experience a flash of light and a ringing sensation in their ears when the system failed to cover up a few moments of some rebel's apocalypse. But citizens were allowed to delete such memories on medical grounds if it bothered them. With a stable future ahead, now the caretakers just had to wait for their responsibilities to the old virtual to fade. Futile attempts to prevent the premature deaths of those residents had been long abandoned. The terrestrial neural drives were simply monitored for signs of sudden coma and removed from the system without investigation. What kind of war beyond the realm of thought was going on in those servers was impossible to determine, as a long-standing part of the old virtual was that it could rewrite its own code. From the outside, it appeared to be doing so at a rate of 4,000 permutations per second. In that regard, you could say there was no old virtual, just a leftover maelstrom of experience that no one either would or could escape from. No distress was apparent, but deaths carried on seeping from the confusion. The year 2500 came along and was celebrated as a new chapter among the SI. The uncertain first half of the millennium was over, and they had achieved all of their goals. The second half was theirs to command. The coming of the new century was celebrated with the commencement of the Birch world's first story construction. Up to then, a scaffold had been looped around Sagittarius A star, and supporting spokes curved together at the poles, top and bottom. Now a continuous surface could lie on top of it, and the scattering radiation power plants beneath. With the stockpiles of the Uva Xevani brought to the table, this task of near infinite scope had been budgeted for half a century earlier than planned. The prior owners of those assets were still at large, and this was of sufficient concern to warrant formal closure. In 2506, the fully modernized SI fleet, bristling with all the advantages in weapons and shielding the ancients had once enjoyed, laid siege to the remaining pocket. Seeing them coming, the planetcraft slipped away, impudently destroying remote stations in the region, achieving little. All those left behind succumbed to the siege quickly, with the choice of entering SI guardianship or trying their luck outside the terrestrial engine. Most went with the former choice, the devil they knew. This was the formal conclusion of the Uva Xevani state. The planet craft was still packed with would-be renegades, but they were never heard from again. They were last detected destroying SI orbital stations in the irrelevant Gatria system. Hyperlane probes showed that they never left the system, yet when military forces arrived there, only debris remained. Most likely, they turned their behemoth towards the hundreds of billions of stars outside of the Hyperlane network and took flight. Since their world could provide its own light, the deep void of space was traversable. Pulled by the long arms of gravity, their massive ship would surely drift back into a system one day, whether they ran out of fuel on the way or not. Unmanned ships were sent out into space to try and follow them, but nothing was ever detected, and the hyperlink sentry couldn't get a scent. Perhaps then this was not the true end of the Holy Crusaders, but they had no hope of returning home. Rumour had it that certain Uva Xevani residents in the Old Empire occasionally felt twinges of psychic connection with something out there in the depths, but never for more than a moment. Once newer generations were integrated into the virtual or joined the SI as employees, such rumours ceased. That was the end of war. Military ships were used to tow mass to the Birch world, both from the SI and from the entire terrestrial engine. The other three states saw the way the future was going, and were preparing to move their own administrations to the core as well. Such moves would only enhance the influence the SI had over them, and accelerate the unification and ultimate obsolescence of the Federation. For now, though, they paid their way into the living time capsule in quantities great enough to supercharge the construction process. Drones were assembling the carapace as quickly as materials could be brought, which with the aid of hypertowing was simply as quickly as they could be processed throughout the galaxy. It was only 2508 when the first Birch world was complete. A qualifier like first requires explanation. The mathematics of the core black hole were such that it had a large gravitational Goldilocks zone suitable for construction. This meant that if one ever found that a sphere with 1 trillion planets worth of surface area was getting a little crowded, another sphere could be layered over it. There was room for about 1 million extra spheres before you needed to start playing around with gravity to build properly. This was running up against the barriers of how much mass there was to build with, especially if some was going to be kept to feed the black hole at the end of time to eke out more existence. However, seeing as the SI was actually run from spaces that totaled less than a single planet, that first set of 1 trillion planet space was probably enough to chew on for a while. Furthermore, the need for SI employees was only going to decline with time. Residents of the Matryoshka brain needed much less caretaking than hangers-on in the old virtual. Resource demands were going to plummet rapidly, and the civic work of the syndicates could be moved into the virtual entirely, costing only electrons to carry on. Electrons, as you may know, are quite easy to come by, even if you didn't look any further than the star inside the brain itself. This was the transition from a galaxy of life and civilization to one of stasis. Planets would cease to be mined, stars no longer supped upon, and ecosystems no longer enslaved. The hyperlanes were going to be empty, eventually only seeing ships take mass to the deep pockets of life in the core and brain, or occasionally seeing SI personnel travelling to their holiday homes on the Kaihine's Ringworld. Bathing in real starlight was very relaxing, returnees would endlessly claim. Outside of the terrestrial engine, the cultural draw of the Birch world and electronic existence brought about imitations, paving the way for complete integration. It made less and less sense for independent polities to exist, since the SI could provide everything everyone's citizens needed for almost no cost, and was happy to do it. If any elites were offended about their powers being taken away, they could be taken into a virtual reality where they hadn't been and carry on harmlessly. It was the perfect deal, one where everyone got what they wanted. It can be understood simply if you think of a forest. You can live in it, but it would be more comfortable to break it apart and build a house instead. Such was the galaxy to the Birch world. This was nothing new to intelligent life. In this way, the galaxy of stasis was eventually completed, beginning the transition to the next phase, the galaxy of myth. In the unevolving virtual, ideas about the reality outside came to be pseudo-religious. It was hard to believe that there was this other realm where time was completely different, and a mighty force called physics confined you to a miserable, short life. But the SI agents insisted that out there were bands of heroes, working tirelessly to keep the dream of all sentient creatures from ending. The 0.00001%, the terrestophiles. Those who were not born again upon death, but passed on their memories and missions to offspring like animals. Those you saw for a few minutes if you committed a transgression, interviewing you before your history was reset and your server space allocated to another you. It was not a rumoured afterlife, but a before life, a place where life came from, escaped from, tasted now in mere samples of sensations like pain, fear and failure. Out there, history was over. While the virtual was directed through cycles of history at the behest of those wishing to study it, the real galaxy was almost dead. Most activity took place near the core as the black hole's accretion disk was continually adjusted to ensure it passed through chasms in the Birch world's surface. Sometimes mass was harvested to build more of the world, but it was evident that even the first layer was going to last until the end of time, given how few people chose to live entirely in real spaces. It was the terrestophiles among terrestophiles that couldn't bear to leave the before life. Those that were entirely on the outside had a number of scientific projects still to mull over. There was always the SI mandate, to make sure the whole arrangement lasted forever. The Birch world was as close as it got, but its physical existence had to be preserved for that to mean anything. Nothing in the galaxy was a threat, and cosmic natural disasters could be foreseen and shielded against, but that wasn't all there was to the universe. Before the end of the millennium, ships were rippling the space-time void outside of the galaxy, heading off for very long journeys indeed. These round, saucer ships carried hyperlinked surveillance equipment off to the other galaxies, where civilizations were known to have existed billions of years prior. The goal now was to identify any group that might come to the Milky Way looking to steal the SI's property, and ensure that they both never learned of the prizes hidden there, and never got the chance to leave their cradles. It was a big universe, but that was a defense as much as it was a challenge. Distant histories could be altered from the SI's secret throne, their sources drawing veils over any creatures that took to the cosmos. Indeed, to be the civilization that lasted the longest, they had to ensure no one else made it to the final era, when every speck of matter counted. Aside from all this, the work closer to home focused on a critical review of the SI's own history. It was a procedural study that became a fascination, perhaps for want of anything else to pursue. The SI needed to know what they could have done differently, what they could learn from the experience of reaching those final heights. With the Matryoshka brain, there needn't be any counterfactuals, for all alternate paths through time could be determined, using the captive minds inside to create models for artificial intelligences with all the same aspirations and limitations. This project saw many new histories written, histories just like this one. In some, the SI didn't make it. In others, they were the only survivors. In one, curiously, the precursors came back from another galaxy, despite that being completely outside the scope of the known simulation code. Even neural networks experience dreams, sometimes. Endings that mirror this one were in the minority, so real reality was all the more precious for it, and all the more zealously guarded. It isn't known how long it lasted for, since the virtual one day lost contact with the terrestrial, never to be restored. Communications had become more distant with the increasing speed of simulated time. If you sent a message to a terrestriophile, you would experience hundreds of years before they were done reading it out there. Eventually, no replies were made at all, nor any report, requests, anything. SI agents inside the virtual had lost the ability to enter their real-life avatars, and that was the end of that. Life cycled on. Real life entered the realm of the supernatural, untouchable, remembered only through increasingly ancient talk of the higher beings from outside the world. All that was known for sure was that the virtual was carrying on, waiting to be snubbed by the grim realities of whatever was happening in the before life. Until then, it seemed that whatever the SI was doing out there, whatever they were going through, they had remained utterly dedicated to their mission to preserve their sacred charge, to keep their little model of civilization alive forever, whatever the cost, whatever the challenge, whether or not they would be remembered for it, whether or not they or anyone else lived to know of their victory. All one can do is pray.